Hello, everyone. Welcome back to eTalks, Art, Culture, Science discussions hosted by Aragon Art and Academy. Today, we'll be talking about art, some art history, some sci-fi art, and we'll see where we'll go. Today, we are here with Professor Rhodes. He is an assistant teaching professor at Rutgers University. He teaches cognitive science. He is a neurolinguist who researches how languages are presented and implemented by the brain. He is interested in the shape of language, how we learn, and what kinds of computations the brain can do. He's also passionate about science communication and maintains a YouTube channel that we will link down below, which is about language, the mind, the brain, and cognition. And today, he will be moderated by Iram, who is a passionate artist. And today, I'll give you guys the floor.
Hello, I'm Iram, and I'm excited to moderate today with Professor Rhodes and talk about some fantasy and sci-fi art with art history. And I'll leave the floor to him.
I think the purpose of today's talk is to talk about why we do art. I think there's like a lot of reasons why a person might produce a piece of art, and I'm just going to draw like as I talk to some extent.
Yeah, that's fun.
Because I like drawing aliens. So actually, it's kind of what I want to talk about. Why do I like drawing aliens so much? I think that this is actually a really valuable purpose for creating art. One of the default modes for creating art, generally we think about expressivity. We want to express something in particular. But I think that there's another use for art that I find really interesting, and that is to create images of things that don't exist, maybe sometimes things that could not possibly exist. And that's to me, fulfilling and enjoyable and fun, and it's like art. It makes art necessary. It's like things that you could not possibly experience any other way, and so to me that makes this really exciting, really intriguing, and it also winds up having a commercial application because like I just went and saw a movie today. I went and saw The Creator, which is about robots and AI, which is like thing I always love, and so a major reason why I wanted to go see that movie actually was for the art. I want to see like, well, what are they going to show me? What is it going to look like? They have to hire a lot of artists to come up with all that stuff, and that was probably my favorite part of that movie, was just what does everything look like. So I did actually talk a little bit about art history, if I'm allowed to talk about art history.
Of course.
Question?
Do you think the commercial aspect of art changes the value of it?
I mean, in like a real world sense, that does seem to be true. Like collectors don't value commercial art in the same way, or like to the same extent that they value, I guess, like more highbrow art. I've always really resented this though. Some of my favorite artists are commercial artists. I really like I like concept artists, but I also really like artists like Toulouse-Lautrec and Alphonse Mucha, who were making poster art in the early 1900s. And those guys nowadays are considered like serious artists. They've contributed to to a couple different artistic movements at the time when they were alive. They were, I guess, maybe they were seen as like a little bit crass at the time. Now we think that was actually really influential. And well, they did it for commercial reasons. They were making posters for plays and advertisements and things like that. But the art they made was real. It was genuine art. It was kind of, in some senses, kind of groundbreaking. So I think people do undervalue commercial art generally. I guess I kind of get why, but I still, I resent it a little bit. Well, I was thinking, in terms of this function of art being a way of showing things that you couldn't otherwise see, things that don't exist, it really does go really far back. So I have this great image of this thing I love. This is a Paleolithic lion man from Germany. It's about 40,000 years old. And it's one of the first artistic figures that we have a record of. It's, contemporaneous with the cave paintings at Lascaux. And it's of a thing that doesn't exist in the real world. It's a lion standing on two legs. It's like, nowadays this is really familiar. It's an anthropomorphic figure. We have lots of cartoons about animals that walk around like people, but it's not something that actually exists in the real world. And so I think it's really kind of fascinating that, in the depth of time, one of the first purposes of art, one of the original purposes of art might have been for people to create things that otherwise just don't exist in the real world. So no matter how you think of art, if you think of art as a kind of expressivity, an expression of something that an artist is thinking or feeling, kind of no matter what, art is always a form of communication. In this case, what you're trying to communicate is something that you have in your head that you can't just point to in the world. You can't be like, well, what I'm thinking of is just that over there. Well, there is no that over there. There's no lion that stands up on two legs and walks around. I can't just point to it. I can describe it with language maybe. But the best way to show you what I'm thinking is just to produce it, to show you, to make it real. So one of the oldest uses of art is to visualize mythological things or religious things. So the other thing I like is from ancient Mesopotamia. I always love Mesopotamia. I love the Bronze Age, and I love these lamasus. I actually have two bookends that look like this that I got from the Met in New York City recently. I thought, why not? It's like such a cool piece of art, and it's a chimera figure. It's kind of like the lion man, half lion. Here you've got like maybe 3 or 4 different animals. It's got the head of a man, but it's got wings like an eagle, and it's got a body of a bull, but it has paws like a cat or like a lion. So you might look at this and think like, well, okay, I mean, this thing obviously doesn't exist, but all of the component parts are animals that exist. So well, we're still kind of in the realm of things that are real, and that's true. But also at the same time, like, yeah, but this combination of stuff isn't real, and you could never see this in the real world by just pointing it out to somebody. The only way to really see it is to make it. And even gods, right? So there's every one of these ancient religions has a big pantheon of gods. This is the god Pazuzu, who, how do you even describe what this is? Like, yeah, he has wings, but he's got 4 of them. And what is that face? I don't even know how to describe his face. He's got some kind of grotesque monster face, and he's got something on the top of his head, some kind of crest. He has bird feet. Oh yeah, what is this weird combination of stuff? It's not anything that you could have ever seen in the real world.
I think it's also interesting how all these works, rather than just content, the style, the form is also stylized rather than trying to lean towards naturalistic, towards like depicting the actual thing. It leans towards what the artist was imagining.
This is something people always bring up about ancient art. They look at ancient Egypt and they say like, why is it that the art looks so cartoony? Did they just not know how to do realistic looking art? And the answer is no. And I can prove that the answer is no. If I'm allowed to like look stuff up, I can show you something. Mm-hmm. There's a really great piece of Egyptian sculpture of a scribe named Copper. Let me just show you this real quick.
The seated scribe?
So look at this. I mean, even from a modern perspective, looking at this, it's as a piece of sculpture, it's so naturalistic. It's so, I don't know, it's so good. And this was, thousands of years ago. This is in that era of Egypt where all of their art that we're really familiar with, this like King Tut stuff, it's all very iconic and cartoonish, and it's always from like one viewing angle. It's like, no, they were totally capable of making something really naturalistic. It feels really organic. It feels really detailed. They just weren't that into it. Like, it was clear that this was a choice for them. So I think, sometimes people underestimate ancient artists, and this question like, well, they just didn't know anybody. Like, that's not true. They were very, very good. But the choices they made were very deliberate.
I think the values change over time, like with the Greeks, like they really valued like perfectionism. So that's what we remember them by, versus like other cultures, like the Etruscans, who were like trying to just depict like the joy of life and like their lifestyle instead of just like perfectionism that the Greeks valued.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a transition from Greek art to Roman art, like sort of like later imperial period. The Romans, they had, what is it called? The warts and all style, where they stopped trying to make everyone look perfect. And they were like, you know what? Our emperor is ugly, and that's just how he's going to look. That's how we're going to put it in the marble. So style is definitely a thing. And also in ancient Egypt, there's a really interesting era with King Tut's father. So when King Tut's father was the pharaoh, Akhenaten, yeah. He changed the religion, he changed the capital city, and he changed the art style. So if you see the art from that era, if you see artistic depictions of him, it looks completely different from everything before and everything after. Like, they were in total control. They knew like what they wanted. I always think that's really interesting. All right, I want to drop. If that's okay. You have other questions for me? What should we talk about?
We could talk about any current aliens that you like, or sci-fi depictions of aliens, or any fantasy creatures.
So have you seen Arrival?
No, but I will now.
Oh, but you will now. Yeah, that's a good one. Because the aliens are genuinely alien looking. Something that always frustrates me a little bit is when aliens in sci-fi look very human. And, I understand there are some theories about why that might be, like the anthropic principle, that like if we meet an alien species, that it's very likely that they will be like us in some way. But I don't know, there's something really fun to me about imagining an alien that looks very, very different from us. Because why not? They might, if they live in like a different environment, they might wind up looking extremely different from us. They have a different biology, they have a different experience, they have a different cognition. So that's what I like about Arrival. The aliens are genuinely very alien, and with good reason.
Why do you think sci-fi films they usually lean towards with aliens? They usually sometimes lean towards scary and othering the alien instead of like a different perspective on it, where it's more positive or lighthearted.
Well, I think the reason for that is that we're always afraid of things that are unfamiliar, and a lot of times the reason that we tell stories about aliens is a way of like embodying this idea that there are things that we don't understand, and being confronted with those is always kind of terrifying. So my favorite alien movies are the ones where it seems scary at first, and then you realize that actually maybe it's not that scary. So I love E.T. And one of the things I really love about E.T. is that the alien in E.T. is disgusting. He looks gross. Like, it does not look cute. I don't want to touch him. I was very afraid of him as a child, But despite that, I think Steven Spielberg does a really good job of making us kind of love him, like makes him very sympathetic. And that's I think that's impressive, actually.
Okay, now I'm gonna ask one question to as a cognitive scientist, why are you so interested in art? Like, how does your perspective shift the way you view art?
How does my perspective shift when I do art?
Yes.
Or how does being a cognitive scientist shift my attitude towards art? Like, why is it so interesting to me?
Which one's more interesting question for you?
There's a lot of things I find cognitively interesting about art. One thing I find very, very intriguing about art in the cognitive domain is that art is very difficult to produce. It's very difficult. If you like try to draw a human being, we all know drawing hands is very hard.
Yeah.
And that's actually really kind of puzzling because you see them all the time. So the one thing that you're probably the most familiar with is your own hands.
I think maybe that's why.
Drawing it is so hard, so enormously difficult. Like, why? Why would that be the case? And I think the best answer is just that there's something in our brains that wants to represent things symbolically. And you sort of have to like learn how to switch that off if you want to do art. And that's a very difficult process of learning how to switch things off. There's also some attentional things, right? Like you have to learn how to pay attention to the things that you're looking at instead of just, you get a gist of what you're looking at. It's like, no, you need to really pay attention. And that's challenging.
Okay. So I'm nervous. Can you explain the psychological and maybe that's an odd question to ask. As someone who studies cognitive scientists, why do you think people everywhere like to make and enjoy art? Is it something that's deep in our nature or how our brain works?
Yeah, so the one thing I can say for sure is there's something very deep about the way that we view narrative and stories. So that on that level, we are very hardwired to think in terms of stories. Why do we like art or like visual art? I think it does. I mean, I think it has to do with this idea of wanting to be able to communicate things that are otherwise very, very difficult to communicate. So, showing someone something from inside your head that otherwise doesn't exist, wouldn't exist, couldn't exist. That's one reason to create art, is to be able to communicate those things specifically. So like what I'm doing right now, it's drawing like a weird looking alien. I could try to describe this, but man, it's so much better, so much more effective if I just show you what I'm talking about.
How do you think this overlaps, like in expressing yourself in different ways with music and writing and maybe fashion with different forms of art? What do you think is what's the value of like these certain types of art and how they differ and are similar?
Well, there's something very, very direct about visual representations of things, whether you're doing like drawing or sculpture or whatever. But if I could just very directly represent the thing I'm thinking of, that's pretty clear. It's pretty clear what the value is of that. The other things like music and fashion, things like that, obviously there's a very creative process, and you are communicating something from inside your mind to another person, but it's, maybe something a little bit more abstract, and you're interacting with other aspects of your culture and other kinds of representations, as opposed to just sort of translating mental imagery directly to another person.
When looking at art, what would you consider, like if you looked at something, what would you first consider like that's art? I can recognize that as something that people created with at least the intention of it being art.
That's a really good question. How do you know if something is art? How can you tell if it was created with intention? That's a really excellent question. Like, I don't know. What do I look for? I guess, yeah, this is only even a relevant question now because of AI, right? Like, this was not even a question 20 years ago. Maybe you just knew if something couldn't have been, if the paint didn't just spill on the canvas by accident, if it had like some order to it, it had to have been created by a person. So I think we're entering an era now where it's like the answer to this question is, I don't know if we know. I don't know if we can tell.
Then when looking at art, like if you know it's AI versus if you don't know it's AI, how would that differ your perspective in it?
It's funny. I have a student who's working on this right now. She's very interested in this question of how does it affect your enjoyment of art or your appreciation of art if you know that it was created by an AI? And I think the truth is that people do view art very differently if it was created by an AI versus if it was created by a human being. And maybe it does so in a couple different ways, and it might vary person to person how exactly that changes things for you. Right now, we're still in kind of a honeymoon phase where we look at AI created things and we're like, wow, that's really impressive, because I wouldn't have thought a computer could do that. But we're also seeing a lot of backlash to AI art, as it's like, there's the threat that it could replace human beings, and I think we don't like that idea. So there's definitely a lot of people viewing AI art as being, in some sense, maybe illegitimate. Like, it's not a product of genuine creativity. It's not very human. Maybe it doesn't qualify as like genuine art.
Well, then what differs it from other types of technological advancements that have either replaced job positions or improved it?
Well, even just sticking with art, this conversation, there was a similar argument in the 1800s about photography. And there was a similar argument about like, oh, well, photographers are not real artists. They don't have the training that real artists have, like painters and sculptors and whatnot. They aren't doing the same kind of process. And there was a fear, I think, that would take away the livelihood of a lot of artists, because at that time, before photography, you think the only way to visualize anything and to have a permanent visual representation of something was to create a piece of art, was to paint it or sculpt it or whatever. You had to create something by hand, because there was no technology that could do that for you. By the way, you see how I like draw lines over and over again, and I just like undo them. This is my process.
No, I think that's the both
Speaking
the
of technology, the
Which
entire way that I do art is enabled by technology. What would I be doing if I had pencil and paper? I would just,
that's what I'm questioning right now.
I would have erased through the paper at this point. That's okay. You're allowed to do that, right? You're allowed to just keep trying until you get what you want.
What's your process of doing art? Now we're on that topic.
Huh? Since we're on that topic.
Yeah.
Well, the technical side of it is basically what you're seeing right now. I work in Photoshop and I have a Wacom tablet. That's maybe less interesting than I guess what I'm thinking about when I do it. And I don't know, so it varies. Sometimes I have no idea what I want to do, and I just start doing something. I draw a shape and then I just kind of see what comes out. Sometimes I do have something very specific that I'm interested in that I want to do, and then that can be really frustrating if it doesn't come out the way you want. You have something in mind and you just can't quite make it happen. But
would you ever use AI to do what you want?
I very often do nowadays. Now that I have that, I do often use AI to do stuff, because sometimes it's really worth it to do it yourself. And I feel if you really want something specific and get just the way you want, it's really worth it to sit down and create something. But sometimes you want something quickly and for a specific purpose. AI is very useful. And I really appreciate AI art, actually, because it's giving people the tools to create things. It gives people the tools to do exactly this process of creating things that you might want to see that otherwise could not be seen. It's giving people the tools to do that who otherwise, maybe don't have the tools or training to do so. And I think that's really cool. And yeah, I mean, there are issues, there are ethical issues. It does interfere with artists' livelihoods, and that's not great. But I do really enjoy the fact that it is kind of giving people access to this, to at least the output of this process. It doesn't give people access to the process because they're not actually engaging the process, but it gives people access to the output of the process, which is a cool thing.
Well, there's also the other idea that since art is really seen as an enjoyable activity and there's people who take commissions, why wouldn't someone just pay someone to do it for themselves, to do art, like similar way in maybe ghostwriters, like if someone who's not capable of doing it, so they would just pay someone else who's willing to do it themselves.
I mean, that's been the case for a long time. I've actually done quite a bit of commission work, like artwork. I used to do this as like a side gig. I used to do commissions. And I always felt a little bit weird about that because it's not my primary means of income. And so I would think, am I putting someone out of a job? The same thing that we think maybe the AI is doing now. It's maybe putting artists out of a job. You can think about yourself if you're a freelancer and it's like you're just doing it for fun. I knew a lot of freelancers that weren't doing it for fun. They desperately needed the work. And so I did sometimes feel a little weird about that. I'm not sure how to feel. Am I taking, money off the table for those guys? But it was fun. I did it because it was fun.
I'm going to go a little bit off topic.
Okay.
And ask you one of those predetermined questions.
Okay.
Can you explain the psychological and neurological basis of creativity? What happens in just an artist's brain in the creative process?
I think at the moment we do not really know. We don't have a super good idea of what happens when someone's being creative on the neural level, but there have been some studies on this. So we have some idea of there's a broad executive network that's involved, but it's that's a network that's involved in lots of stuff. So right now I think it's a little bit hard to tell. Also, I'm not necessarily a qualified expert on that exact question, but I've read about it a little bit and just enough to know that I'm not sure I know exactly what's going on.
Do you have any interesting sources that you could share about this topic?
Any interesting what?
Sources for more research.
Oh, I'd have to go look it up. But I could look it up and I could share it with you. Maybe you can put it in the description of the video.
In the beginning, you mentioned how people have been exploring the impossible through art and drawing things that didn't necessarily exist. Mm-hmm. How does sci-fi art contribute that now? What does it mean when people
let's talk a little bit more about history. So this is a really amazing, very famous piece of art by Hieronymus Bosch. This is from I should have looked this up, maybe the 1600s, I want to say. But so it's a couple hundred years old. It's post-medieval, and it's inspired by religious mythology, but there's a bunch of stuff in here that just doesn't exist. You would never see in real life, and it's just the weirdest stuff I've ever seen in my life. This stuff by Hieronymus Bosch. It's so bizarre. And then going into the future, I actually grew up. My dad was really into Salvador Dali, so we had a lot of Dali books and prints and stuff in the house. And I was always really fascinated by this piece. This is just a detail from a dream caused by the flight of a bumblebee around a pomegranate, and has some motifs that are kind of classic for Dali, like the elephant with the stilt legs. And you got this really interesting, the tiger jumping out of another tiger's mouth, jumping out of a fish's mouth, jumping out of a pomegranate. Really bizarre stuff that, just impossible stuff. And in the early 20th century, you get these artists like Dali and René Magritte and others who are kind of decomposing art, the surrealists. Sometimes the decompositions are really simple, right? So this is another impossible figure, but it's impossible in a really simple way. It's just carving a cavity out of a person using negative space in an interesting way to show something. Or René Magritte has these really simple manipulations of here's a person, but their face is not where it's supposed to be, and there's just an empty space where the face ought to be. Rene Magritte also, I just found this out today. I wonder if he was the first person to draw a castle on a floating island in the sky, because this is something you see in fantasy art all the time now. But he was doing this in the early or mid 1900s, which I think is really fun. And oh, this one's fun too. I love the guy with the orange head floating above his body. What is it even supposed to be? I don't know. But anyways, your question was about science fiction. So here's one of my favorite science fiction artists. This is Mobius. And Mobius was always drawing these really elaborate, fascinating sci-fi landscapes. It's like, I don't know, is it possible to imagine traveling to a planet that looks like this? Maybe. So one role for this kind of sci-fi and fantasy art is sometimes imagining real things that could actually be. You know, I know NASA will hire artists to draw things like, we need sketches. We need to show people the kinds of stuff that we're working on. So here's a concept for a Mars rover or a lunar lander or a new kind of rocket, and they'll have an artist draw that. I know Sid Mead did a lot of that kind of stuff. So this is a Sid Mead piece, and it's like sort of a hypothetical kind of space station in the shape of a torus, like a donut. Why? Well, so if you spin it, then you can induce a kind of artificial gravity via centrifugal force, right? So people living on the outside of this torus shape, you can build like a whole civilization here. So they're imagining things. It's like, yeah, you're imagining things that don't exist, but you're imagining things that like could exist. And so I think that the sci-fi art has a really important role in imagining our future. I think that's really cool. And, you know, talking about it being commercial, like, yeah, a lot of sci-fi art is commercial because it's used for entertainment, but a lot of it also is used in official channels. So like NASA will hire these artists, engineering firms will hire these artists. Sid Mead has like a big portfolio of stuff that he did for engineering companies, for technology companies, because they want art that represents their vision about what they want to create. It's a thing, again, it's like a thing you couldn't really communicate any other way. If you want to show somebody, this is what we're thinking of, that is going to exist. That's one way to do it is by using artists.
Do you think the surrealist artists like Dali, like, did they somehow contribute to like the growth of sci-fi art?
I think so. So I think sci-fi art comes from two sources. There's a couple artists I really like, illustrators from the 1800s, Edmund Dulac and Ivan Bilibin. And they were doing a lot of art, they were like creating illustrations for folktales. So things like the 1001 Nights, or Russian folktales about like Baba Yaga, things like that. And that's again stuff that's like, it's in keeping with this old tradition of gods and monsters and things like that, things that aren't real but are culturally important. I think a lot of sci-fi fantasy art comes out of that tradition. But I think that the surrealists also played a really important role, because they were imagining just really bonkers stuff that nobody had, I guess, really thought about until then. And you see, I think, the DNA of a lot of that stuff in modern sci-fi art, just really, really strange things, especially in the 70s. I think sci-fi in the 70s was really influenced by this. You get these very, very strange aesthetics where we want to explore, like, what would a true alien life form or a true alien civilization be like? Let's imagine it. The aliens from Arrival, they do remind me of something that I might see in Dali. They're, those weird stilt legs. They don't have a face. They have very strange shape. It looks very inhuman. And Dali especially was playing around with this kind of stuff, strange inhuman shapes, morphing things into kind of grotesque proportions. That might be what aliens wind up looking like to us. They might look grotesque.
I think also like the growth of photography and like surrealist photography, I think that probably like led to a really big growth of seeing how can we trick people into thinking this maybe looks real.
Absolutely. And I think in a sense, photography may have like liberated artists, because before the invention of photography, the Western tradition was tending towards neoclassicism and realism. We wanted to create idealistic, detailed, realistic looking images of people and things. And after photography came around, then it was like, well, if you're an artist and you're just doing realistic depictions of a person, there's not a really big market for that if you can use a camera to do the same thing. So what should you do if you're an artist? And I think it really freed them up to explore like really weird stuff. They could use your imagination. Like, what do you want to do? Totally deconstruct the whole medium, play with shape, play with composition, make things that are totally alien and new and novel. Like, that's kind of cool.
With characters like Superman and like superheroes, who are technically like alien, but like are depicted as humans.
Uh-huh.
I think they like there could be like very different ways like people could approach it. With like seeing like how we like if aliens weren't this grotesque types of people, would we still be scared of them? Would we still?
We should make a version of Superman that looks like a snail or something. Yeah, and part of why Superman works is because he does look like a very archetypal American man, and that was part of the original intent, right? He embodies truth, justice, and the American way. And that wouldn't really work if he looked really alien. So he has to look like a person. But there's something interesting, I think, that comes out of that, and that is that Superman looking and passing as a human is interesting commentary that's kind of related to passing in real life. People who are like multiracial in the first half of the 20th century. If you were multiracial, you might be able to pass as white and maybe like escape prejudice. And there's this really fascinating and troubling idea that your identity is constructed, and I don't know. There's something very strange and almost mindless about prejudice. Superman was created by two Jewish comic creators, so I think maybe they probably were thinking about something like this.
I think one of my favorite superheroes is Supergirl, and the main thing that differs from Superman is that she did not grow up on Earth. So I think it's also very interesting, like how her storyline, it's way more about her being alien and angry, like, and learning how to and actually feel like she doesn't fit in, versus Superman, who is basically human, just with practically like emotion.
Yeah, so Superman is a funny character because he's he looks exactly like a human, passes as human. Culturally, he's human. He only really knows human culture. So is this a real impediment to him? And it's like, no, not really. The only thing that separates him from other people is his power. I guess he could kind of do whatever he wants with his power. He chooses to do good things, but he doesn't have to.
Do you think people can communicate purely from art? If in a museum there were no descriptions of like no plaques, like describing what the art means, do you think that would still have value?
That's a really great question. I think without the plaques, the question of like, what would you get out of it? Would you get what the artist wants? And this taps into maybe that idea of like the death of the artist. Should we necessarily care what the artist intended? Is it more about like what we get, what we want to get out of it? Yeah, I don't think you can ever guarantee that somebody is going to get out of a piece of art what you want them to. And that's just the nature of art. That's the game, man. So I like having those plaques in the museum. I always read those because I like to know what they intended. And sometimes it is very different than what I experience. And that's the way it is. We want to communicate something, but you can't ever be totally sure because you don't know someone else's experience.
Now we're going to move on to eTalk special questions. One is, what is your favorite instrument?
Yeah, so I'm a woodwind guy. I played bassoon for many years. I still have my old bassoon. It's in the closet right over here, but it very badly needs repairs. I think I have to say bassoon. Can I give a top three? Can I do a top three? Am I allowed to do?
No, I think it's fine.
I'm a woodwind guy. I love double reed, so I love the bassoon. But I also, as far as double reeds go, I also really love the Armenian duduk, which is another double reed. That's you hear that in a lot of soundtracks whenever they want to get like a Middle Eastern sound. I noticed, I think starting with Last Temptation of Christ, they started using it as like the Jesus sound. So if you watch a movie about Jesus, it's very likely you'll hear a duduk. And I also really like fipple flutes. So things like recorders. Do you ever play the recorder, like when you were in elementary school? The flutophone. I love those. It's like an entire family of instruments, and I love them. And I have a tenor recorder and I have an alto recorder, and I have a tenor and I have a soprano recorder, which are just fun mess around instruments. But there are like really pro versions of those, and like someday I'll get a really nice Baroque recorder. It would be very fun, I think.
Moving on to our second question, who is your favorite artist?
Maybe, can I do a top three on this one too?
Yeah,
like I said, I do really like Ivan Bilibin, who's a Russian illustrator, and I love Jean-Léon Gérôme, who is older neoclassical artist. I love Mondrian. I just got a big book on Mondrian. Actually, this is interesting. So I just got a free book someone gave to me about Pete Mondrian, who's you recognize his stuff. It's with the like lines and then he'll have blocks of like blue and red and yellow primary color stuff. Very aesthetically pleasing to me. But it's interesting, like seeing his life's work kind of played out over time, because he started out very much as like an impressionist, doing a lot of landscapes and stuff, and he starts to experiment and get more abstract, and then his like final few pieces of his career are those pieces that we know him for. So I'll put him on the list. I like Mondrian quite a lot, and I also like seeing
And
that trajectory.
this is a now change question.
Okay.
What are your top 3 favorite artworks? So just
top 3 favorite artworks. I think I got to say that Dali, the dream caused by the bee flying around the pomegranate. That one is just so cool. It's so bizarre. I have to say, I love that painting. What is my? I always think of Jean-Léon Gérôme has this painting of a gladiator arena, and that one I really like too, the gladiators. And that's that's not a thing that's not like an unreal thing, but it's definitely a thing that we can't see anymore. It's like doesn't exist anymore, and it didn't exist when he painted it. Which makes that really fun and interesting. I mean, you know what I'm going to put on the list? I'm going to put that wooden bust of Copper, the Egyptian scribe, because that's one, I don't know why, but that's a painting that I go back and I look at over and over again. Every so often. I just have to look at it to remind myself that like they really did this. They really were that good back then. And I spent a lot of time looking at like his mouth and the contours where the mouth goes to the cheeks. It's just like all of these shapes and details that if you're not paying attention, you don't think about when you're looking at a person. But if you said like, okay, now sit down and carve a person out of wood, you're like, oh, that's actually really hard. How do I know exactly the curvature in this area? And it's so smooth, but it looks 100% lifelike, and it don't know, it blows my mind. So I think I'm gonna have to say Copper. And also, it's kind of a shame we don't know who did it, who the artist was. It's just lost to time.
Thank you. And I'm going to give the mic to Zain.
That was such an interesting conversation. So we talked about our history, and then we brought some sci-fi. And so there's like this theory that time is like a loop, and every several hundred of years there is these like overlaps. So I thought about as the aliens, they do not look like humans, but sometimes I see them as like a hybrids between nature and humans. And then we talked about the lion of the human, which is also a hybrid. And then you guys have made some great comments regarding why do we like art. And one thing that I can really mention, from our conversation is that, Professor, are you aware of Vic Muniz?
Of what?
Vic Muniz, an artist, which I believe he's like a from Latin America or probably Brazil, I would say, in South America. But Vic Muniz is an artist who went, who made lots of great works in New York, but then went back to his home country and made a work out of trash with workers who collect trash.
Nice.
And there's this documentary named Wasteland, which I will be putting in the link, the description below, so you guys can check it out. And there is this line he says, he explains all these like trash collectors, all these people who are living in those slums. He's saying that, have you ever went to a museum? In the museum, people they're not standing up straight. They're always like with their eyes and they're leaning forwards, and they're always looking very carefully. And they look very funny from the side because they're always leaning in and they're just, looking at it very carefully. But I think that's the kind of message that we should get of always like looking closely and looking closer to analyze, to see what it could mean about the artist, what it could mean about the society, and of course, what it could mean to us. So that was a very nice conversation. Thank you, Professor Rhodes, and thank you, Ina, for moderating it very nicely. Ina, we want to see your drawing.
No, I don't do watercolor ever, and I try to.
Oh, that's amazing! Like you got so much more color than I did in the same amount of time.
And then we will be sharing both of your artworks on our social medias as well, just so people can see what you guys have been drawing while we're talking. As always, thank you so much, guys, for listening and checking out today's eTalks episode. We will be here on YouTube and also on Spotify as well. Make sure to follow our Instagram linked below and check out Professor Rhodes' YouTube channel to learn more about cognitive science and how it's more fun. So thank you so much, guys. And thank you, Professor, for joining us today. We will see everyone next week. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.